Hi, this is Paul. Certain segments of Christianity are in a tizzy over Christian nationalism, and Christian imperialism basically gets a free ride. What do I mean by that? Well, in many ways, Trump was America first, sort of an interesting turn on Christian nationalism in the United States. But Biden, what is he? And I think Biden is really a turn back to a certain kind of Christian imperialism, but you sort of mask over the Christian part. And I think if you want to see some of this, you have to see it from the outside. Now, The Rest is History is currently my favorite podcast. I usually listen to it on Saturdays, and so I have a few built up by Saturday and can get through a number of them. But in a couple of episodes, one on Americanization and one on the 90s, I think Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, I think that's his last name, really do an excellent job looking at some of these issues. So I want to dive into some of them today. I've been talking about various Christian nationalisms and imperialisms as we've been part of I've always been part of the American religious culture, and I did a video on that not too long ago. But let's take a listen to first towards the end of the Americanization. They use an S instead of a Z. That podcast and see where they go with it.
Yep. Okay. Here's a question from James. It's an excellent one. Hi guys, love the pod. So we like that. To what extent is Americanization and American exceptionalism influenced by the widespread belief within the US that it's a nation blessed by God?
It's a gift to you this question,
Dominic. What's your view on that?
I think I can answer this with no need for any input from you. No, I think this absolutely... So American exceptionalism is clearly a very religiously infused idea, the idea of the shining city on the hill. And that's an idea that they've got from 17th century English Puritanism, obviously. But I think Americans, irrespective of their religious identity, share that sense, don't they? They share the sense that America is a nation chosen by God, even if they don't believe in God. They think they're a chosen people, and that their nation is special. It represents an ideal rather than just a sort of a story of shared belonging. And that it represents, even people who are the most sort of radical critics of the American government within America will often then go on to say, because our country should mean something more than that, because we've failed to live up to our ideals.
This isn't the real America. Right. This isn't America.
This is what everybody said after that.
Tom Holland tries his American accent.
Trump riot, wasn't it? This is not America. This is not who we are. And everybody else outside America was saying, no, this is who you are. It's America.
We've seen the films. We've done the video games. We know this.
But absolutely. And I think it is completely religious, in inspiration, this idea, don't you?
Yeah. But I think that from our point of view, I think that it's part of a common stock of kind of Anglo-American Protestantism. And again, I think that means that it's not just one of the reasons that we're so kind of susceptible to it, open to it, ready to accept the justice of it, is because we share a common kind of seedbed of theological assumptions. So the idea that people should be awakened, that people are steeped in sin, that the Spirit should descend and that people should be awakened. And you have this thing, the Great Awakening, that begins in Britain and spreads to America in the 18th century.
And in the previous video, I of course began with Jonathan Edwards. And Jonathan Edwards didn't consider himself an American as such, even though he was born on this continent. He considered himself part of, at that point, what was this British culture war, which was vehemently Protestant versus Catholic. But for them, this was all about the destiny of the world. And again, you can go back, and I didn't read a whole lot of that in the George Marsden, Jonathan Edwards biography, but that's exactly what the existential crisis was about. And that vision that here we are, the Puritans, we're here to save the world. This takes on different labels. They won't call themselves Puritans anymore. They won't necessarily believe in God anymore. But this overall world-saving ethos continues to move through and work through.
And then you have a succession of them because, of course, you have an awakening. People are born again. They have their eyes opened. The Spirit descends on them. And then they return back into sin. And, it's...
And if you read again, Marsden's biography of Edwards, that was Jonathan Edwards. In his early teen years, he had an awakening, but Marsden is quite careful to note that, well, Jonathan Edwards' father, who is the minister, understands that, well, people have these awakenings and then they slink back and they need another awakening and then they slink back. And it's this process back and forth that really creates the transformation that they're looking for. In case you need another book, I'm obviously on a George Marsden tear right now. I'm reading Religion and American Culture, A Brief History by George Marsden, and this is one of his newer books. And it's an attempt to sort of take this gigantic issue and break it down into a smaller, much more digestible piece. And in the book, you very interesting, get this sense of, and this is still a big issue that we deal with in America itself, the degree to which, okay, you've got the institution of the church, and then you've got this revival spirit. Marsden notes, a good many people, especially those touched by revivals, were intensely religious. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, full of religious enthusiasm. Many more, most of the population, in fact, were religious only occasionally or ignored religious services entirely. Some also trusted in minor folk magic that had little to do with traditional Christian connections. And so what we've sort of seen, and I think, and we'll get to that in this video, is this decoupling of religion from the institutions. And the religious impulse feeds into a lot of other manifestations. The great dynamo generating this remarkable American religious vigor was continuing revival. The period from 1795 to 1865 was marked by recurrent outbursts of revival throughout the states. In 1801, spectacular New Camp Meeting revivals occurred among both whites and blacks, especially in the Kentucky frontier. At the other end of the social spectrum, in the same year, Timothy Dwight, president of the Congregationalist Yale College, spurred a campus revival that helped inspire a whole generation of Connecticut Yankees in spreading the gospel into new settlements of the West, now Midwest, and throughout the world. Meanwhile, Methodist movements, which had become an independent denomination, was growing at a spectacular rate among the common people, surpassing even the Baptists in number by 1820. At the same time, countless local revivals sprang up, often with highly popularized and democratic versions of the gospel. Innovators formed several new denominations, each marked by a grand expectation of ushering in a new age of the Spirit. By the 1840s and 1850s, impressive percentages of enslaved people had turned to Christianity, which became the overwhelming dominant religion of their culture. While women usually had the majority in these revivals, in 1857 and 1858, urban revivals among businessmen in the North drew them into noontime prayer meetings in numbers unlike anything anyone had seen. During the Civil War, notable revivals had been reported in both Union and Confederate camps. Just the overview of these remarkable developments leads plausibility to estimate of renowned historian Perry Miller that the dominant theme in America from the 1800 to 1860 is the invincible persistence of the revival technique. Mark, who's been on my channel, is often over at the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord and also on our Discord, heard me talking about Billy Graham, and he had no idea who Billy Graham was. And he noted that when he lives in this area of the country, and he kept seeing the signs for the Billy Graham Library. So he went to the Billy Graham Library. And for him, he was walking into a strange new world. He had never seen any of it. Now, even just looking at this picture here of, I can make the picture a little bit bigger, of the Billy Graham Library, the Spirit is manifest in the architecture. You have the barn. You have undoubtedly what is a cosmetic silo. You have a metal pole barn hidden behind this obviously iconic rather than pragmatic barn structure. And you can go in with the virtual tour. And so I was talking to him on Discord, and if you look at the virtual tour, you have all of the iconography of this revival ethos. And you can, he said there was this animatronic cow. Well, there he is, this animatronic cow. Now, I think if I were talking to Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, they would be laughing their heads off at this. But other people in, let's say, New York or California, they would be mocking this. But this is religious iconography for a deep part of American history. And again, if you look at a book like Jesus and John Wayne, you have this rejection of this kind of thing. Well, the real story isn't that this kind of thing is dominant in American culture. That's a given. That's American religious history. And so if you go on, you have, at each point you have the camp meeting. You have, in some ways, I was trying to find language that my friend could get into, and I said, this is sort of Cracker Barrel meets church. Now you can take that a lot of different ways, but at every different stage. Now it's easy for coastal elites to mock this, but isn't this just sort of the comparable thing to the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C.? Now it's as this post-Christian kind of embarrassed about Christianity, Christian imperialism progresses, they're going to have to deal with this. And that's a lot of what's going on in our culture in terms of dealing with this history. Now, this whole, you can do a virtual tour. You've got a buggy up there at the ceiling. Mark pointed out that when you go into some of these places, let's see if I can get into some of them fairly quickly. Oh, come on. And then there's a movie, and then, okay, now we're going to go into the LA camp, the revival. And again, the sawdust, all of this harkens back to this revival history. I want to get to, okay, we're going to go through here. Now we're in the home, and for some of us, this is just sort of zooming us back to the 1970s. This was how you decorate your home in the 1970s. I went in how many homes in the 1970s that looked like this. Okay, and it's, now he's going to talk about China, Richard Nixon going to China. All right, now we've got, radio, media, Larry King. Oh, come on, navigating. I want to get to, okay, now we're going to get into here. Mark mentioned here, he says, oh, look at where all of the Bible verses are placed. Up high, and he talks about Vervaeke, how you look up high, and well, there are all the Bible verses and the various ministries, and we're gonna deal with, okay, his relationships with the presidents, which was not a non-controversial thing. The team, the Billy Graham Association. We're going to get international. Okay, we're going to have the fall of the Berlin Wall at some point. You can just sort of view 20th century history from, you go place to place in this museum. So this is American history. This is American history for a lot of people.
It's a kind of truism to talk about the Great Awakening, but I think that it's manifestly in that tradition, and I think that's why it's had the impact that it's had here, is because we also are heirs to that kind of essentially Protestant sense that we're lost in sin and we need to be awakened to our moral responsibilities, and and also the biblical narrative of Exodus, of a people in slavery who are chosen by God to be redeemed from the evil oppressor, the imperialist oppressor. This is in its overtly biblical form is something that Martin Luther King absolutely enshrined as the kind of the heartbeat of the civil rights movement. Now with Black Lives Matter, that's not overtly Christian. Indeed, often it's in overt terms anti-Christian, but it's still manifestly drawing on those traditions. And I think that, again, that's why it's kind of, transplanted so easily here.
And it's very interesting that the relationship between, America was an English colony. And what America did was sort of like, well, they sent the prisoners over to Australia. We got all the religious dissenters. And this then became the promised land.
The interesting thing is that what we have lost in Britain is the sense that did exist in the 18th century, that Britain was that country, that Britain was chosen by God, and that Britain was the city on the hill. No one believes that now.
No, but I think that what you see in Britain, what you also see in America, which is a sense that we are kind of unique in our evil.
We definitely see that.
That we're dignified by our wickedness. We are the enslaver. We are Babylon. We are the evil empire, and therefore we need to repent of that. And only by repenting can we be brought into the light. And I think that. The sense that both America and Britain, that both Americans have and the British have, that somehow there's a kind of deep stain of evil there that needs to be purged and repented for. It's a kind of arrogance almost. It's a kind of solipsism. It's a kind of, it's a narcissism. It's placing us at the center of history, at the fulcrum of history, even if, 100 years ago, it was because the British Empire was great. Now it's because the British Empire was uniquely evil. It's a kind of narcissism.
I agree with you.
And I think that's something that Britain and America definitely share.
There's no conflict in the world that there won't be somebody who says it was either the British Empire's fault for misdrawing maps, or it's the CIA's fault plotting in the name of international Americanized capitalism. And it's always putting themselves at the center of the story and their own moral failings. Yeah.
I don't think you get the same thing in France, for instance, which would be the obvious parallel to us.
Yeah. No, the French don't think that. And of course, as we discussed in a previous episode, people like the Dutch are, delighted by their own empire. And
to be fair to the Dutch, not all, because the Dutch also were part of this Anglo-American Atlantic world of Protestantism. So I think that the Dutch also are, to that extent, perhaps.
Am I not right in thinking that
as well?
The big YouGov survey shows the Dutch are prouder of their own imperial past than anyone else?
I think they said that 40% of the Dutch were, but also that means that 60% aren't. And there are huge there's huge debates in the Netherlands about, was it Black Pete, who is
that's right.
A festive figure who turns up wearing blackface, and I think that's a kind of very much the kind of debate that is informed by American cultural concerns. So anyway, interesting stuff. Do we have
Now I want to plot some of this history, and so I went to YouTube, of course, and searched background on the New England Transcendentalists, because in many ways you can see the process from New England Calvinism to New England Unitarianism to the New England Transcendentalists, and this sort of becomes a core religious factor. And what I found, which was, I thought, enormously charming here in the middle of COVID, was Professor Asher Harris from Fordham University, who basically in the summer, probably planning his syllabus, sits with his daughter and made a couple of YouTube videos probably for his students. And I was the second subscriber to his channel, and I thought, now I am really on the ground floor. His daughter was probably the first subscriber, and I was the second. And I wish they'd made more videos, because actually on YouTube, and even Marsden in his, I gotta grab that book. Even Marsden in the books of his that I've read so far hasn't really touched on it. It's touched on somewhat. Here's another Christian Reformed historian, Mark Knoll, taught at Notre Dame. And Mark Knoll does treat it to some degree in his A History of Christianity in the United States and Canada. So There's another book that I have to put on the shelf. But I wish there were more things on YouTube about the Transcendentalists to contemporary American spirituality. And so I'm trying to, the Asher Harris has an account on Twitter, and I'm going to try and send him a message, and we'll see what I can get on. But let's listen to some of how he describes this passage. Now the volume's a little low, but I boosted it up, and hopefully it'll be okay.
That had really shaped New England thought from its formation during the 16 and 1700s. The clergy started to reject them. A lot of the Calvinist doctrines that had really shaped New England thought from its formation during the 16 and 1700s. The clergy started to reject them. Really the only school of theology, the place where every minister in New England went to be trained, was Harvard. And by the year 1800 or shortly thereafter, almost all of the faculty of Harvard that taught divinity had become Unitarian. Okay. They rejected a lot of the doctrines of Calvinism, and what they were really trying to do was go back and develop a system of beliefs that they felt actually were more reflective of the New Testament. So there was a whole bunch of different people. It was shaped a lot by William Emery Channing, but they kind of coalesced around four basic principles. One, they believed in the fatherhood of God. They rejected.
It's great. You can hear someone doing dishes in the background. You think my YouTube channel is rough?
The idea of Jesus being divine. Mm-hmm. So the idea of the hypostatic union of Jesus as a being who was both fully human and fully divine, that was rejected by the Unitarians. In terms of human nature, they had a much more positive view of human nature than did Calvinism. They believed in that people had a potential for virtue, that people could become good based on the strength of their own spirit.
Mm-hmm. Could they redeem themselves?
They could, and it didn't require.
I just find this so charming. Dad's got to make a video. Daughter probably set up her cell phone, and she's going to be it's just lovely. It's just lovely.
Atonement.
Okay.
Unlike the medieval doctrine of atonement that had dominated Christian theology for many centuries, where original sin was so grave a sin that no human could atone for it, that it required the self-sacrifice of a person who was both fully human and fully divine. They rejected that, mm-hmm. and they believed in it. They believed in the mission of Jesus as altering the human heart. So they believed that each person had within himself the ability to model himself and pattern himself after the example of Jesus and become virtuous. So those were the central premises of Unitarianism. So as we'll see, Transcendentalism consisted of a group of people, most of whom came from a Unitarian background, but that was kind of the trajectory of the thought of New England, where it was originally Calvinist. Calvinism was rejected by the Unitarians, and then Transcendentalists came along and rejected the Unitarian tradition.
Okay. So, which philosophical issues did Transcendentalism really address?
So, I think really at the beginning of the Transcendentalist movement is an issue about epistemology, the question of how does man know? Mm-hmm. And much of the philosophical premises of the latter part of the 1700s were based on John Locke, who believed in a tabula rasa. Every person was sort of a blank slate, and that person would know through experience. And we'll be covering epistemology more as we go through the semester, but just at this stage, I think it's important to know that this was really a key jumping off point for Transcendentalism, that they rejected the Lockean epistemology in favor of belief that a person could come to know through his own intuition. They were heavily influenced by people who were influenced by Kant. And I think that they thought they were influenced by Kant, even though by now, most people who really, now know Kant and examine the way they thought, they don't really think the Transcendentalists were accurately based on a Kantian epistemology. But from their perspective, they viewed Kant and, in general, the course of German epistemology as breaking from the English Lockean tradition, based on experience, and moving to one that was based on intuition. There is a very important philosopher by the name of Victor Cousin, a French philosopher, who by now is not particularly widely known, but for the Transcendentalists, Cousin's emphasis on intuitive understanding as a source of knowledge, that was really key to their understanding of epistemology.
Okay.
So if you're interested in that, you can obviously watch more. The key thing is that, so the timeline basically goes, you go from the Puritans to the Unitarians over to the Transcendentalists. And these Transcendentalists, you all know Emerson, Thoreau, these are very formative figures. And these in many ways will sort of shape this. Well, it'll stay within the Christian fold until, of course, it sort of doesn't. And what you have in American history is this mingling of all of these traditions. And you would think, oh, it's the intuition versus empiricism or rationalism. No, those are going to get mixed together. And all of these things come mixed together. And of course, it's very interesting reading, get a good biography of Dr. King. The autobiography of Malcolm X is I wouldn't trust it as a biography as such. It's an important document in terms of the history, but there are some better biographies of Malcolm X. The civil rights movement and the counterculture, this is where you sort of see this breaking out of church walls. Now, this is a common theme in American Christianity. Mark Knoll will bring out these themes in an important essay that he wrote, which unfortunately is no longer on the BioLogos side. But part of what happens in American Christian history is that American religion keeps sort of breaking out of church confines. And you see this in the frontier, the circuit riders and the sawdust revivals. These keep sort of getting outside the walls of the church, outside of the hierarchy and the structures and the elites and everyone who is sort of managing this. Now, in the South, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a minister, that's a deeply Christian church movement. And Dr. King mobilizes and uses the churches as sort of a base from which to launch this civil rights movement. Now, Dr. King's emphasis, again, is on calling America to its Enlightenment roots. Dr. King will keep pointing back to the Declaration of Independence, and they say, this is, in his most famous speech, this is a promissory note, and it's time now to pay. It's time for America to treat all of its children as equals. Okay, that was Dr. King's theme. Now, of course, lurking in the wings are the much more radical movements of the civil rights movement. You've got the Black Power movement and Stokely Carmichael. You've got especially early Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. And if you haven't read some of that, it's fascinating reading the whole. I mean, the Nation of Islam, in fact, has a complete metaphysic behind it that it's almost a Gnostic situation where the white man is created by a lesser god that has somehow triumphed, and the world needs to be set right. I mean, the Nation of Islam, it's not really Islamic, but it's I gotta be careful what I say. Again, read a good biography of Malcolm X and get a sense of the historical context, and then, of course, even just saying Nation of Islam would lead Malcolm X to look at historical Islam more than just necessarily the work of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. But you've got this tension in the civil rights movement. And so what sort of happens is that eventually the northern institutional elite, looking at their options, they back the civil rights movement. And what was really cool about this article in Patheos, how the civil rights movement converted white liberal Christianity, I thought the author was dead on right in seeing the American civil rights movement as yet another iteration of this long history of revivalism. Now, it doesn't have, like with Billy Graham, the sawdust on the floor and the rough-hewn benches and the tent. And, it's astounding in North America today. You can find revivals where, in fact, they've got a perfectly adequate building there, but next door to the building, they actually put up a tent. Why? They put up a tent because that's the iconic religious thing to do. That is the icon of this American revivalist spirit. Now, of course, once we get into the 1970s, things are really going to change. And the revivalism, sort of, let's say, blue church revivalism, now is in some ways anti-Christian and against Christianity. And we're going to find this flopping back in terms of Republican and Democrats back and forth. Because remember, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. You get to the civil rights, the beginning of the civil rights movement, the South is consistently Democratic. I mean, a lot of people are too young today to understand that history, and Americans don't pay much attention to history anyway. So, you have this going back and forth. And so key elements in this is, of course, Vietnam, where not suddenly, but America continues to lose sort of its innocence about its, basically the imperial struggle that it is having with communism. Marsden, in that book on American religious history, notes that if you want to get a sense of, let's say, how Jonathan Edwards felt about Catholicism, it was probably something akin to what Americans felt about communism. This is an existential world struggle. And so for Jonathan Edwards, again, that Jonathan Edwards was working as a missionary to American Indians, and the real horror was that these Indians would be lured into Catholicism by the French Canadians, because of course the Pope was the Antichrist. I mean, it's hard for Americans today to appreciate just how long, enduring, and vehement the Protestant Catholic struggle was for centuries. And then, see, again, I read, I'm going to have to do a fuller review of Jesus and John Wayne, because the real story is not that this long-standing tradition endures. It's how quickly it's been overturned and masked, and the labels have been exchanged. So here we find Chuck Colson, born again, prison ministry, Chuck Colson disillusioned by, Richard Nixon. It wasn't too many years ago that I read Chuck Colson's Born Again, and I found it just a fascinating book in terms of this narrative history. Evangelicalism was always a more conservative movement. Marsden calls it a primitivism. You're always sort of looking back. Someone in the Friday question and answer comment says, what about these Orthodox? And are we always just going to say, the world fell apart in 1054? Protestants say the world fell apart at the end of the first century. That somehow Jesus and his disciples looked like Baptist ministers. But that's sort of the nature of a religious movement. We always tend to project ourselves back onto our heroes, and that's why, hence the term, be careful meeting your heroes. I have books from the middle 20th century Christian Reformed Christian Reformed Church, where if you read these books, the reason we have elders and deacons is you can find them right in the Bible. It's just lifted right from the Bible right onto the Christian Reformed Church in 1960. And that's sort of the movement that takes place. And so now religious and political conservatism sort of track together in some ways with this. And this is where these progressive and conservative labels really do sort of betray us, because what are happening are these long-standing, we can call them principalities and powers, these long-standing motivations just travel through history and get expressed in the different political parties. But now America becomes this mass exporter of culture. And again, in listening to Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland talk about this, I just had my eyes opened now, Tom Holland's about 4 years younger than I am. I don't know how old Dominic Sandbrook is, but just had my eyes open in terms of, okay, well, what's life like in the UK? We're all sort of prisoners of how we grew up, but I just found the podcast incredibly enlightening.
After the First World War, and I think from the 20s onwards, you have this persistent anxiety, specifically in Britain. There are different kinds of anxiety elsewhere, but I think we have a very particular anxiety that we have been infiltrated, I guess, by Americanness. And you have that now when the arguments about the culture wars and so on, that we've just imported unthinkingly these American ideas, and we're arguing about them and they don't apply to us.
I think that's true. But I think...
And where I'm going with this is, well, these American ideas, these are, in some ways, these are so foundational that they are religious ideas. And so first England colonizes America, and then America returns and colonizes England back.
But I think that it's interesting that, in terms of the culture wars, which I think is actually the way that America is being most influential on us at the moment.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
What's interesting is that again is a kind of flip from when we were growing up, when really it was the right that was very pro-American. Yeah. All the debate around, again, going back to US air bases in Britain, Greenham Common campaigners, CND, America was seen as the enemy. Thatcher was disliked not just for her own sake, but because she was seen as Reagan's mole.
Yes,
The kind of the explosion of finance in with the Big Bang and everything in London was seen as a process of Americanization. And so Canary Wharf, had the look of America, skyscrapers and things like that. So the sense that Americanization was a kind of right wing project, I think that's now flipped, because I think that the debates, the passions in Britain at the moment are massively coming from America. I think so. Now I think it's the left that's been Americanized. So we were talking about Anglo-Saxons. The sense that is a problematic phrase.
Yeah,
so you're no longer now. Absolutely, but you're no longer supposed to use the word Anglo-Saxon to describe the period between the end of the Roman Empire in Britain and the the Norman conquest, because Anglo-Saxon is seen as being an inherently racist, white supremacist phrase. But that's only the case in America.
Yeah, I've seen that. You've been involved in that argument, haven't you?
Well, it's infuriating. It's infuriating because they say we should use early medieval England or early English, but it's the English Defence League. It's not the Anglo-Saxon Defence League. Anglo-Saxon doesn't have that connotations here in Britain. It's a purely American connotation, but because it's American academics leading it, British academics, or some of them, kind of obediently say, "Oh well, we must abolish this phrase," and ignoring the fact that, of course, as we've already discussed, Anglo-Saxon has a quite different.
We appreciate your subservience, British academics.
Different connotation for the French or the Germans, So, I think that's been the kind of the intriguing change, is that now it's the left that's been Americanized.
I completely
and actually,
agree
you
with
get a kind of strain of suspicion on the right about America.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I think that's because. It's partly been driven by the internet, hasn't it? So that if you're a sort of engaged, liberal, sort of academic-y, intellectually kind of person, then you're part of you see yourself as part of a conversation that's dominated by Americans simply because there are far more of them speaking your language than there are of you. And I think you see this in terms of...
Far more of them speaking your language than there are of you. Whose language is it? Do we really talk English or do we really talk American?
I mean, I remember sort of 25 years ago teaching undergraduate courses about white supremacy in America, and white supremacy being a very specific thing to do with slavery and the sort of incomplete legacy of Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War and the creation of these kind of white supremacist regimes in the American South. And it was a very distinct, specific American thing. And now, of course, white supremacy is a sort of concept that is bandied around in a very vague, undefined way, and people talk about white supremacy in Britain and European countries and so on. And it's not the same thing at all. What they've basically done is just taken an American term, and that's true of almost all these culture war battles. The statue toppling started in America. Well, I mean, some of it started in South Africa, but a lot of the most notable examples are Confederate statues in America. And people effectively been copying what they see in the States and translating it to the sort of British cultural landscape.
Now this is really interesting, because why are they copying? What are they copying? It's basically the revival spreads across the shores. And this is what you had in the First Great Awakening. You have George Whitefield comes over to America. He's an English Calvinist, and you have the First Great Awakening. You have this revival. And so essentially what we've got going on is this sort of revival, which is now, spreading from the UK. But it's, this isn't religious. Really? What's your definition of religion?
That is a big change, because that's not something that left liberal people would have done when we were growing up in the 70s and 80s, is it? I mean, they would have recoiled from the idea of America.
So the question is does it happen simply because we speak the same language, and so we are prone to think that phrases that are bandied about in America have a relevance here?
A lot of people in the world speak English.
Or does it go further than that? Is there a desire to kind of be American? So in a sense, the desire to feel that you're fighting white supremacy or whatever here, in the way that radicals are in America.
I think it has to do because there is a moral telos. There is an image. There is a sacred image. There is a sacred way to be that you wish to. Maybe it's the beings of light. They're going to talk about. This whole episode is great. I listen to every one of their podcasts. I think they're all terrific.
That presumably is kind of drawing. It's part of a continuum that reaches back through people in the 60s being inspired by hippies or whatever, the example of music there, into the 50s through rock and roll. I guess ultimately, going back to the 30s and the 20s through Hollywood, that America just kind of provides the template for kind of, what it is to be cool, to be cutting edge, to be on the zeitgeist.
Now, there is a bit of that. And actually, a great example you mentioned the 60s is the British protests against the Vietnam War. I mean, we weren't in the Vietnam War, but but people have protests about it anyway.
Yes.
So that's pure Americanization. I mean, that's just that really is just copycat kind of. We've seen it, so let's do it in Grosvenor Square in 1968. Yeah, I think there's also a deeply buried sense, I think, that America is the kind of fulfillment of Britain. And that obviously goes back to the 18th century, when in the US War of Independence, that America was the kind of summation of the British kind of, the liberal experience, I suppose, the good old cause of the English Civil War, that America was the realization of that, and that we were moving, we're sort of moving towards becoming America.
But that's also...
And of course, I mean, understand the Puritans come over, and this was why they came. They were going to, now in this new land, well, the virus wipes out other people and they're going to finish the job. But this fresh land, they're going to terraform it again. Read 1793. This blank space, they are going to now construct the kingdom of God. Now that's deeply Protestant, because you look at, okay, the Catholics and the Orthodox, they all got it wrong. We're going to do it right. It's church planters that do this all the time.
So they're in France, isn't it? So you have, I'm kind of thinking, one of the very first...
It was the good old cause of the English Civil War, that America was the realization of that, and that we were moving, we're sort of moving towards becoming America.
But that's also there in France, isn't it? So you have, I'm kind of thinking, one of the very first, not exactly Americanization, but looking to America as an example. There's a famous meeting in, I think, 1778, something like that, where Benjamin Franklin is the ambassador to Paris of the newly founded American Republic, and meets Voltaire and introduces his grandson to Voltaire, and Voltaire kind of blesses him in English and basically says, "Yeah, America, you're great, yeehaw." Equivalent.
That is Voltaire. Kind of, we've had TSA.
Tom Holland, yeehaw.
Voltaire impersonations.
Yeehaw. And yes. Voltaire with an American accent. This is spiraling off in directions that I had not anticipated. But there's a sense that, kind of just right at the beginning, that Voltaire is kind of handing over the torch of the Enlightenment to Franklin, who is, the embodiment of a republic before France has become a republic or anything like that. And the sense that, it's a new world, and new worlds are good.
Yes, it's America being the future. And I think that's actually what's really interesting about the last few years, is that it's the first point that I can really think of when America has not felt like the future.
Yeah. Now we're going to get into this decadence, Douthat theme. And actually, I'm going to go back to their episode on the 90s where they get more into this.
So all through the 20th century, when people were arguing about America, or when people said Reagan is Nixon is a Nazi, Reagan is a fascist, all this sort of stuff, they still never doubted that America was ahead of Europe to some extent. America was literally ahead. They got their films earlier. They, pioneered Coke and McDonald's and Levi's and rock and roll and all this sort of stuff. But I detect in the last sort of 10 years or so, especially with the Trump sort of imbroglio, a sense that America is no longer seen as humanity's future or the West's future, that America, there's this real sense of having taken a wrong turn or and you can say.
And it's interesting because, some of you upset if you're a Trump fan that he mentioned Trump, but that's actually exactly what Trump said. And when I get to the other, our airports look shabby compared to the rest of the world. We need to make America great again. And what were the kinds of examples that Donald Trump gave about that? He gave about, the airport should look better, public works. And, for all of Trump's 4 years, the story on Donald Trump is going to be, he talked a certain game, but push comes to shove, he didn't do anything. He couldn't get it done. Now, again, it's very interesting because when I listen to people on the left talk about Obama, Obama would have been a great president if the darn Republicans hadn't stood in the way. And the other side are going to say, Trump would have been a great president if if the deep state, if QAnon, if the Democrats hadn't sandbagged him. The definition of greatness is that you somehow figure out a way to overcome your adversary. These guys also have a terrific episode on greatness. But, these themes come through. And what's interesting is that, so Trump wants to make America great again. Well, America first. Christian nationalism. Okay. But what is the other theme? The other theme is the American empire. American internationalism, American imperialism, America leading the way, and America has lost its way. That's what Trump comes in and says, America has lost its way. And Biden comes in and says, with Trump, America lost its way. And so we're going to have the third Obama administration. But you see these themes come through again and again and again. At the same time, and again, there's just all these layers. American evangelicalism and Pentecostalism have conquered the world in terms of the spread of Christianity around the world. But what happens with Christianity always is it goes into a land and then the people make it its own, and then the people make it its own. And so I expect with the rise of Christianity in China, and we'll see in another number of decades if in fact China, Christians in China eventually overthrow the communists in China, and where on earth that would lead. But, Christians in China are patriotic, even though they have, they've imbibed deeply from American evangelicalism. But also, how many Chinese movies, Crazy Rich, that movie that was out a little while. It starts with a Bible study. You see this in Korean dramas. Now, of course, South Korea is a deeply Christian country, and in some ways the most Americanized of the Asian powers. But so you've got American evangelicalism and Pentecostalism. It's spread like wildfire around the world. You can't go into slums anywhere in the world and not find Pentecostalism just growing by leaps and bounds. But we pay little attention to it. Why? Because, the Blue Church is looking at their own cathedrals and their own narratives, and so, we'll just dismiss those Pentecostals. But again, look at the United Methodist and the big battle over same-sex marriage. Why did the Blue Church lose the battle in the United Methodist Church? It's because of the African bishops. And so suddenly, right there, you have two value systems that are now at odds. Oh, we want to be an international church. That's sort of the imperial church. But all these African bishops are saying, no, we're not down with same-sex marriage. Roman Catholic Church, growing throughout the world. No, we're not down with same-sex marriage. Well, what do Americans do? Well, if you want third world aid, because you either, it's your poor or your gays or your women, or all of these. This is why hierarchies develop, because you've got all of these value systems to somehow figure out where they land in your structure. The other major religious export is what I call progressive liberationism. That's the Blue Church. That's what America, and when people vote religion. Again and again, I'll hear, Democrats complaining about poor whites. They're voting against their economic fortune. Yeah, because they're voting their religion. It's a far deeper, more pervasive narrative. And okay, now I'm gonna jump into their '90s podcast because they really get at some things there.
Kind of thing when you see it on a Twitter thread or something. Why can't people just be kind?
When people say that, they mean it in the most vitriolic way.
Yes.
Usually.
Yes, but I think the kind of the ideal of of kindness, of love, of everyone just hugging each other and not kind of kicking each other in or whatever, is, as a myth, it does kind of have a kind of enduring resonance. Maybe not. I don't know. I'll leave
my son does something at school that he refers to as kindness studies. And it's surely only, it's surely only a matter of time before that becomes a degre. Anyway,
that's all the influence of rave culture. Okay, this is a great question from Nicholas. Again, I hope I've pronounced this right. Joan. Were the 1990s the last decade of uncritical Americanism on screen, and indeed perhaps beyond screen? Films like Independence Day, The Patriot, Armageddon, or even Saving Private Ryan seem unthinkable in the way they picture the US nowadays.
I totally agree with that. Actually, that's a really good observation. I think that is true. I think there was America, it had its issues, but it clearly, there was a sense that Hollywood projected that they had, in inverted commas, won the Cold War. It was always presented that way. It wasn't presented as a matter of kind of Gorbachev's reforms going wrong and the Soviet Union falling apart. And there was this quite uncritical sense. I saw Saving Private Ryan in a cinema in America, and I can remember the scene. They've got a colossal American flag flying at one point. The shot is of this American flag. And there were people sobbing in the auditorium around me, and I just sat there. I've never felt so British in my life. Just this, I just wanted to leave. I just wanted to leave the cinema, to be honest. I'm just so churlish and nasty as a person.
Saving Private Ryan famously featured the British war effort, didn't it?
Yeah, well, of course. I think, yes, and I think that's actually a really interesting story the last few years, is the collapse of America as this sort of idealistic model. In their own minds, actually, as well as in ours.
And again, what did Trump run on? This is exactly what Trump ran on. Douthat's ideas about decadence. Eric Weinstein, in the 1970s, America lost its way.
You see American politicians breastbeating about the fact that they're being mocked elsewhere in the world, or they're being seen as a sort of a model of what to avoid. And I think that would have been unthinkable back in the 1990s.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting that both of us talking about, remembering how we got connected to the internet, both of us have a link to Stanford. Both of us had American friends who helped to set it up. I mean, but essentially we felt like kind of primitives.
Absolutely. America was
the future. Whereas now I think when you go to America, often it's certainly in terms of its infrastructure and even in terms of its kind of, the phones and things, it seems.
Yeah, I completely agree, Tom. I totally agree. I think that's a bit. I first went to America in the 90s and was struck by the modernity of it. I mean, they had things that we didn't have. And I also, even just tiny piffling little things that were somehow symbolic. So I can remember going, and they're having films that that had not come out in Europe, but I'd never even heard of. Because their film schedule was always ahead of ours.
Yeah.
And then going back home and saying to people, "Oh, there's a new Arnold Schwarzenegger film or whatever. You won't have heard of it, but I've seen it in America." And that sense of them literally being ahead, technologically, culturally, that has gone, hasn't it? The internet has destroyed that, but also there's a sense that America has failed to kick on after 1989, 1990.
Also, I think my favourite series of the 90s was The X-Files, which I loved because it was kind of engagingly paranoid. You could watch it and enjoy it, and it was clearly nonsense. But the kind of the vague hint that perhaps there were aliens in Roswell or whatever. Whereas now all of that has become completely terrifying. I mean, essentially, The X-Files has become QAnon, and it's not fun. It's not fun at all. On the topic of weird stuff that people believe, question from Steve HP, wonderful man. The history of the 1990s was affected in important ways by Pope St. John Paul II, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Osama bin Laden, the destruction of the Ajah Mosque, and the soft power of the Dalai Lama. Are Western historians, you, Dominic, equipped with a conceptual framework to explain this?
I've got a great conceptual framework, actually. You don't need to worry about my conceptual framework, Tom. So this is, I'm guessing a question about religion, really. It's a question about...
Yes, I think it's... And specifically institutional religion. So not the kind of... alien X-Files kind of spiritual.
And again, religious institutions.
Well, not religious stuff that you get in the 90s, but organised.
So it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because the 1990s felt like a kind of death of God period. The sort of Fukuyama book and the idea that sort of humanistic liberal democracy was the future. And that I definitely remember sort of putting my purely sort of personal memory hat back on. The way that people talked about Iran and the Ayatollah and the Rushdie fatwa and whatnot, that these were relics. These were soon to be forgotten kind of relics. People would often say it's medieval sort of behavior. And they would talk about Iran as a medieval regime and people did that a lot actually after 9/11 as well. And it's clear now that people, particularly in the sort of secular West, underestimated the resilience of religion and the way in which religious identity and religious loyalty would play a part, particularly in the post-Cold War world. And I actually hate this question because it's such a gift to you.
It is, because I had no interest in this question at all in the 90s. I mean, it was nothing to me. I barely registered on my radar. Whereas now, of course, I have realised that was completely wrong. And I've written a book about it called Dominion, which is available from all good bookshops. And on
Shameless.
that...
Bookshops. I don't think we have those in America.
Absolutely shameless.
On that, I only agreed to this topic because I could see that question would come up. I think we should draw a line. I mean, I don't see how we can top that.
Okay. Well, I think you should give me one. Is there one moment from the 1990s that you think we don't talk about that we should talk about more? That you think historians will look at? Is there anything unexpected?
Dominic, you can't ask me that question. I feel too tired after
whatever
it is, 40 minutes. But clearly you do. So tell me, what is the moment? You clearly have an answer to this question.
I think actually probably Britain not joining the euro from a British
very
perspective.
good. Yes, very good.
I think not joining the euro was... So we did Brexit before and
you almost get the sense that the gravitation of America keeps Britain, tries to keep Britain. They're the aircraft carrier you can't sink.
And I think we've both read the book by Robert Toombs about, who's a big Brexiteer, Professor Robert Toombs, about Brexit. He makes the argument that Brexit would not have been possible had we joined the euro. And I think he's right, because the economic damage of crashing out of the euro would just be so great. And that was actually that will probably go down as Gordon Brown's, apart from, as he would himself put it, saving the world in 2008 after the crash. Gordon Brown's great contribution to British history. I mean, great as in important rather than as a term of approval. By not joining the euro, that made Brexit possible in a way that...
Or would you say inevitable?
Well, Toombs would say inevitable. But that's a massive question, isn't it? Was Brexit inevitable? Surely there's a podcast in that.
Yes, we must get Helen Thompson.
Yeah. Anyway, we're just having...
She's brilliant on this topic.
We're now sharing our backstage conversations with...
All right. It's interesting how the end of the Cold War changes things. And earlier in the 90s episode, they talk about the fact that the 90s in many ways begins with the fall of the Berlin Wall and ends with 9/11. And so the decades never quite match up. And also earlier they talked about, recent history versus past history. And especially in terms of the very interesting question about what history is. But the Cold War, especially before the 1960s, was sort of the peak of overt American imperial confidence. Again, one of the very interesting takeaways from Jordan Peterson, Ali conversation. When she went to the Netherlands, she was just tremendously impressed by the Dutch and the way the trains ran on time and the way the police could be called and the rights that she had and her frustration with the West, that it has sort of lost its confidence. But it's interesting that the confidence isn't really lost, but sort of shifts between these focuses and crosses over the political aisles. And so it's just fascinating the way these things twist and turn. But in many ways, you sort of come full circle. It's sort of back to a Calvinism of sorts, but now new and improved, where you have at least the Democratic members of Congress who take a knee with a degree of multicultural garb to confess their, are they confessing their imperialism? But you first need to sort of confess your imperialism before you can sort of keep it moving in denial. I mean, it's not different from Caesar Augustus as the foremost defender of the Republic, except the emperor, of course, is the complete opposite of what the Republic is supposed to be. Or is it? You have these twisting, these intricate, feathered, layered narratives that go on and on and on. And this is how we establish our authority and our supremacy, because we realize and have confessed our imperialist sins and therefore pay no attention to the imperialist behind the mirror. Just this morning on Twitter, the new Captain America apparently is an LGBTQ plus activist. Truth, justice, and the American way. Well, that's Superman, but same business. Who, in fact, what are these gods? And they always sort of manifest what's in the principality and the power. And of course, in the evangelical church, we watch this. We watch this sort of twist and turn around. I should find it. So the publishers have sent me this book, and when I get into these reviews, some of you are not going to like it. I make enemies on lots of different sides in terms of some of my ideas about a variety of things. So the making of biblical womanhood. But what some of these books, what some of these books have in common is sort of a mythology about, well, when American religion was pure, or was the church ever pure? So is this a purely progressive narrative, or how does this work? When I when I saw that Beth Moore had left the Southern Baptist and the and Lifeway books, because suddenly in 2021 she discovered sexism and racism, and I quickly looked up her age, and she's 63, so she's 6 years older than I am, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s and was fully aware of sexism and racism in the Christian Reformed Church. And so I actually wrote the author of this piece, and he said, well, it was sort of the Trump experience that shook her. And yeah, this stuff is going to get confusing. And then the author of this book, do you realize that the same folks fighting against critical race theory are also fighting against male headship? Are fighting for male headship? Racism and patriarchy are part of the same oppressive system. Pull on the thread of one and both will start to unravel. But the big fight in the Christian Reformed Church is same-sex marriage, and the new synodical report on sexuality, which is a conservative report, which is that and the election of a same-sex married deacon in Neeland Avenue. I mean, these two things will sort of may become the hammer and anvil that shred my own denomination. End Christian patriarchy. And then the question, should be women, the big fight of the 90s in the Christian Reformed Church of this 80s and 90s was, should women be ordained to different offices of the church? Well, who has more influence? Your local pastor or priest, or Beth Moore? How is the church as a platform as compared to YouTube? There are deep, deep questions that we are struggling with. Deeper work. Yeah, a lot of deep work. And these things go back. They go back centuries, and they go to the core of, what does Christianity mean? How does it work? We're caught in a lot of double binds. You can't simply go back. And you have to work on the intellectual, the institutional, and the popular. Just to keep my eye on the time, but just this morning, the little bit from Brett Weinstein on his talk with Jordan Peterson says how, we need our experts to sort of be displaced from the market forces. I couldn't believe he said that. Fascinating. How to work this stuff through. The church needs to figure out, in my opinion, of course, and if you're listening to my Sunday sermons, you know how Jesus navigated his culture war. All of these strains, we have to see. I can't say come to terms with, because I've got John McWhorter in my mind. What does it mean to come to terms with? What does it mean to actually deal with all of these things? How can we find better ways forward, better answers? How can we be both faithful to our Master, our Lord, and live at this time and place with all of the different forces that have been around us? So, leave a comment.